So now in this one, we're on page 11. This is Hol Achma Anya. So somebody who has the other edition and can find it should tell what the page is. And the other, it's before the 4 questions. Okay. Everybody has it? So now, yeah. This is an Aramaic introduction, and as you'll see, some of it could not have been said at the night of the seder. This is just a collection of things that were said in conjunction with the activities the day before Pesach and the night of the seder. The first one makes a declaration about the matzah. Now, let's see how they translate this. Like everybody. What's going on here? Oh, I see that. Oh, so the Hebrew is at the top of the page and the English is at the bottom of the page. Done in a very funny way. They write, this is blood of affliction, which our ancestors ate in the land of Egypt. The word in Hebrew, in Aramaic is anya, and in Hebrew it's more like impoverishment. It's the bread that we had when we lacked resources, not necessarily being in pain, which our ancestors ate in the land of Egypt. And the simple reason why they ate matzah at that time is because from the time the water hits the flour to the time it comes out of the oven is about 12 minutes. You probably heard 18 minutes. That's a different matter altogether. That's how long you use the oven without undergoing some kind of purification for it. But the individual batches go through in about 12 minutes. There used to be people, maybe there still are, in the Shuk Bukhari behind the yeshiva over here, where they do it. You can watch them do it. You can order it on the spot. And if you're a slave and you're coming home at night and you're making a meal, you don't want to wait a half hour for the dough to rise and then punch it down and wait another half hour for it to rise again and then put it in the oven and wait for it to bake for a half hour. You don't want to do that. You want to eat quickly. So, on the one hand, this bread is identified as a bread of slavery. Now, as we will see, if we get that far, when we come to actually do the mitzvah of matzah and we identify what the matzah is, it'll have a different character altogether. The matzah changes its character through the procedure of the Haggadah, and other things change in coordination with it, and we'll talk about that when we get to it. So this is what you say when you're sitting down. You have to identify what the matzah is. Then we say, Kol dichfin yesav yechol. Anyone who's in need, let him come and eat. Kol detzrich yesav yifsach. Anybody who is in need, let him join in our Paschal sacrifice. You cannot say that at night. To be able to be included in the Paschal sacrifice, that has to happen before it's offered. You can't just walk in and have a meal, and that's in the afternoon. So this sentence must have been said in the afternoon before the Paschal sacrifice was slaughtered. So it's not indicative of what happened that night. And of course, it's indicative of the charity that people expressed at that time. Then it says, Hashata hachal shana bo ba'arad Israel. Now we are here. Next year, may we be in the land of Israel. Quiz time. Do we say that sitting here in Yerushalayim? Was this only said in Babylon? If we say it here, what are we saying?
Again next year.
Again. But it doesn't say it. It says this year we are here. Next year may we be in the land of Israel. So it sounds like here isn't the land of Israel.
Does it say Israel or say Zion?
No, but Arid Israel, the land of Israel. Yeah.
Quick halachic question that's right on this. I came from America. This will be my first Pesach in Jerusalem. Do I hold out 1 day or 2 days?
That's a very difficult, tricky question, and there are different opinions on the subject. And it might depend upon what your future plans are, if you have future plans.
I'm trying to make them based
Yeah,
on
so
that
you
decision.
need to ask an halachic decider. I'm not a halachic decider.
Rabbi Breitowitz is
Rabbi
that?
Breitowitz is tops.
Okay.
Rabbi Breitowitz is tops. But it's a very tricky, and as I say, there are different opinions. So the tricky question here is, when it says, this year we are here, next year may we be in the land of Israel, the question is, who is we? Me personally? My nuclear family? My clan? My tribe? Who's we? How about I suggest that we should be the whole of the people of Israel? Well, even if I'm sitting in Yerushalayim, there are a lot of Jews aren't. So it's not perfect in the words because hacha usually means here, but those who count it as part of the fixed text of the Haggadah, and everybody says it, the idea is that the Jewish people should be in the land of Israel, not just my own personal relatives. And then it concludes, Ashata Avdei, Shana Boa B'nei Chorin. This year we are slaves. Next year, may we be free. Now, that's a relative term. In some periods of history, people who didn't live in the land of Israel really suffered a kind of oppression and limited rights and opportunities. Sometimes Jews in the land of Israel also suffered that way. During the time of the Assyrian dominance, when before the Maccabees revolted, the Greek influence was here and was enforced by military means, and it was therefore very difficult. So the idea of moving from outside the land of Israel to in, and moving from a period of less freedom to more, are independent ideas. They're two separate ideas, both of which we hope will be achieved. Okay, that's all I have to say about that. Now we come to one of the most famous and difficult parts of the Haggadah, the 4 questions. Let me read through the translation, and I want you to just think about the title, 4 questions, and see whether it makes sense. Let's read the translation that I have and see what we get from that. And the other translation I think is different. Wherefore is this night different from all the nights? On all the nights we eat unleavened bread, and this night only unleavened bread. On all the nights we eat any species of herbs, this night bitter herbs, not only is a mistake, because we eat other vegetables. On all the nights we do not dip even once, but on this night twice. On all the nights we eat and drink, either sitting or leaning, this night we all lean. How does that translation sound to you as the 4 questions?
One question.
Isn't it really 1 question and 4 answers? How is this night different? Well, I'll tell you how it's different. A, B, C, D. Doesn't sound like 1 question with 4 answers. If you read it as, why is this night different? Why do we do each of these things? Strictly speaking, you'd have 5 questions. You could read the first sentence as an introduction to the other 4 and read the other 4 as questions. Why is it we do this? Why is it we do this? Why is it we do this? You could read it that way. There's another problem. In Hebrew, the word for question that's used here is kushiyah. A kushiyah is really a statement of an objection or a problem. Usually it's some kind of contradiction. The word for question without prejudice in Hebrew is she'elah. But it's not called arba she'elot, it's called arba kushiyot. There is a very deep and important explanation here from the Abarbanel, which not only gives, I think, a deep insight into the questions, but also explains how it's related to the answer. Well, let's try one more pass. Could this be the observation of a child, let's say a 5-year-old, who doesn't remember last year, but he sees things happening, and he's wondering about them, and he's asking, innocently, as to why these things are happening? That can't be. For two reasons. First of all, some of the things he asked about haven't happened yet. Really? We're only going to eat matzah tonight? Why is that? Some people eat matzahs from time to time all year long. That doesn't stop them from also eating chametz at the same meal. They eat both. At this point, the child has only seen one dipping of vegetable in liquid. The second one is going to take place later. How can he ask about two if he hasn't seen two? How does he know that everybody's going to lean? So one problem with saying that it's asking about things that puzzle the child is that some of the things he's asking about haven't happened yet. And also, other puzzling things that have happened, he doesn't ask about. You wash your hands. Usually, at a holiday or on Shabbos, you make kiddush, you wash your hands, make hamotzi, and eat. Well, make kiddush, wash your hands, and then go on with some other ceremonies. That's very strange, very unusual. Doesn't ask about that. You have karpas, either a little piece of celery or a little piece of potato or something else. You make a bracha on piyadoma. That never happens during the rest of the year. So this isn't the questions of a child observing the goings on and asking why they're being done. Barbanel points out that the questions are divided 2 and 2. If you think of the symbolism of the activities, 2 are dedicated to slavery and 2 are dedicated to freedom. Well, the first one is only matzah. We just identified the matzah in the Aramaic portion as the bread of slavery. So that's a symbol of slavery, at least at this point. Tonight we eat bitter herbs. Yeah, bitter herbs are a symbol of slavery. On this night, we dip our vegetables in a sauce. We don't just eat salad. No, we have salad dressing. That bespeaks a kind of comfort level and resource level that's associated with freedom. And we have our banqueting couches. We don't do that anymore, but it was customary in Roman times, other times. You didn't eat sitting up. You had a banqueting couch with a small table in front of you with your food, and that was the comfortable and noble way to dine. So the first 2 are citing symbols of slavery, and the second 2 are citing symbols of freedom. And then the Barbanel puts the question this way. We have a lot of dates in the calendar which commemorate past events or past conditions. Some of them are joyous, like the holiday of Pesach, which commemorates our freedom, and the holiday of Shavuos, which commemorates the receiving of the Torah, holiday of Sukkot, where Kodesh Baruch Hu cared for us and preserved us in the wilderness. We have the Tisha B'Av, where we commemorate the destruction of the temple. Other fast days which commemorate attacks and destructions. Each day commemorates a theme. Now, if that's the background of the calendar, Barbanel says, here we are commemorating 2 themes, both slavery and freedom. What's that? What kind of commemoration is that? How does it fit into the structure of Jewish commemorative days and performances? That's the question. Now, if you have that in mind as the question, let's now read the answer and see if you can put precisely what the answer is. The answer is, we were slaves in Egypt, and Hashem, our God, took us out from there with a strong hand, outstretched arm. That's, according to Rabbi, that's the answer. Can you put the answer concisely in terms of what the question asked? What are we commemorating? If we have symbols of both slavery and freedom, what then are we commemorating? Why isn't this a two-dimensional commemoration with contradictory themes? Remember, the answer is, we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and Hashem, our God, took us out of there. We're commemorating the transition from slavery to freedom. That's why you need symbols of both. And that's why the two symbols of slavery come first, and two symbols of freedom come second. Because you have one leg on each side of the line, and you're transferring from slavery to freedom. That's what's being commemorated. It comes out to be a very beautiful, direct answer to the question, according to the way the Barbanel explains it.
Which one means eternal God? And the eternal art, is that just a different wrong translation, or the eternal art God?
Sometimes the four-letter name, Yod and a Hey, Nevav and a Hey, in some translations was translated the eternal one. And I'll tell you why. Because in Hebrew, the root, Hey Vav Hey, is a root of existence or being. And the typical understanding of the word eternal, though it doesn't reflect its semantics, as I was taught in graduate school by one of my professors, is that eternal means always was, is, and always will be, filling all of time. So that means being which is absolutely permanent. And that's why we want to translate it that way. Now, this professor, Nelson Goodman, pointed out that semantically, eternal refers to temporal, the time, and means outside of. So eternal really means outside of time altogether. Not filling all of time, but being disconnected from time. But people don't take it that way, don't understand it that way.
You say that as a good translation?
Which? Disconnected from time?
Yeah.
It's a good translation of the English word. If you're talking about the Hebrew word is the name of God, and eternal would be just one characteristic, even understood in a typical way rather than a literal way, only one characteristic, and I don't think there's any reason to use that as a characteristic, a central characteristic. One thing you could have written is the Creator, because His being is absolute, necessary, independent, and everything else has its being given by Him. That's why the Ramban explains it, and that's what we mean by Creator. So that would be closer to the meaning of the name. Okay, so now this paragraph, as we just read, starts. We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and Hashem took us out of there. Hashem, our God, took us out of there with a strong hand and with an outstretched arm. We'll come back to that. And if Hashem had not taken out our ancestors from Egypt, then we and our children and children's children would have been subjugated to Pharaoh in Egypt. Now, one of the things that we hope to help you learn is how to read carefully and precisely. I'm going to read the two sentences again, and I hope you can pick up a contradiction between them. Just a blatant, outright contradiction. we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. And Hashem, our God, took us out from there with a strong hand and with an outstretched arm. And if Hashem, if HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God, had not taken our ancestors out of Egypt, then we and our children and children's children would have been subject to Pharaoh in Egypt. What's the contradiction?
We versus us, referring to us, and then our ancestors.
Okay, who's the we? If the we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, we, you and I, then how can you go on to say, if Hashem had not taken our ancestors out of Egypt, we would have been, excuse me, it says we were. The second sentence says, we weren't. That's counterfactual. It's not true. And the reason we weren't is because thousands of years ago, God took our ancestors out, and therefore we were never subjected to the Egyptians. So the question will be, who's the we? And the one way to answer it, based on what you said, one way to answer it is that in the first sentence, the we is the nation. Sometimes when we have guys here from Great Britain, I say to them, don't forget that we won the Revolutionary War and you lost it. With all your professional soldiers, all your superior firepower, all your training, we won and you lost. So you could ask, we? Who's we? I mean, like, you weren't there, Gottleib, and your ancestors came from Russia and Poland. Like, what do you mean we? We refers to the nation. This nation won a war against that nation 250 years ago, 300 years ago. In the second sentence, we're talking about the local population now. We in the local population were not subjected to slavery because God took our ancestors. We're part of the same nation, but now we're breaking it up into the local contemporary population and the historical population. So I have to shift reference. When we get on later in the Haggadah, we'll see that won't be good enough. We'll have to do something else as well. That could be done here. And now there's an interesting. Well, let's go through the whole thing. It says some translate. How do they translate here? Yeah, it says if God had not taken us out, our ancestors out, then we and our children would continue in bondage to the pharaohs in Egypt. I don't know. Does that mean that if it had not been an Exodus, the empire of Egypt would have lasted forever? Empires come and go. Don't tell that to Americans who think that they'll be here forever, but okay, they come and go. Why would anyone think that if God had not taken us out, we would have been slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt forever? And one answer to this question is to notice a change in vocabulary. It starts with avodim hayinu. We were avodim. And then it says if Hashem had not taken us out, then we would have been mishuabadim. Those are not the same word. They have the same root, ayin base dalet, but they're not the same word. Eved means slave. Mishuabad means that someone has a hold on you, some legal restriction on you, but you're not a slave to him. Shibud in Jewish monetary law is like a lien. When you take a lien from the bank and buy a house, now think carefully. When you take a lien, you take a mortgage. You take a mortgage and you to buy a house, and you pay for the house with the bank's money. Who owns the house? No, you own the house. If somebody trips and falls in the house, they sue you, not the bank. It's your house. But since you bought the house with the bank's money, you can't sell it and get paid for it before you pay off the bank. And therefore, when you sell your house, the buyer makes out 2 checks. One check to the bank for the remainder of the mortgage that you haven't paid yet, and one check to you. And only after the check to the bank clears in the bank and they get their money, can you cash your check to get your money. So they have a restriction on you as to what you can do with the house. It's not that they own it, but you're restricted in what you can do with the house. That's a shibud. And one explanation here is this. Of course, if God had not taken us out of Egypt with the great Exodus, with the miracles and all the rest, eventually the Egyptian empire would have been conquered by somebody else, or it simply would have fallen to decay, and there's no reason to think that we would have been slaves in Egypt forever. But we would have been forever beholden to our slave condition in Egypt. We would have entered history as freed slaves with all the deficits that freed slaves possess. You can see this in the United States of America. Those who were slaves and then achieved political freedom, legal freedom, still did have, and still to a certain extent do have, the remainders of the deficits that they suffered as being slaves. So this is what we're saying. Had not God taken us out, yes, we wouldn't be working necessarily for affairs, but we would have still been affected by and restricted by the experience that we had as slaves.
What was the two words you were saying that were different before?
So the first word in the paragraph, avodim. And then, in my Haggadah, on the fourth line, the fourth word, meshu'abadim. And you see that they both have the ayin beis dalet root, but they are different words. And now comes a very deep matter, which I had explained to me by Rabbi Bullman, who was the mashgiach in Ohr Somayach a long time ago. Even if we were all wise, all discerning with sharp intelligence, all of us were elders, meaning we're very well educated. Even if we all knew the Torah, it would still be a mitzvah to, I'll say tell, but I'll change it in a minute, tell of the Exodus from Egypt. And all those who magnify, they multiply the descriptions of the Exodus from Egypt, that is very praiseworthy. So, let me explain to you just a piece of logic. If you say, even though A, still B, what you're saying is A and B are in conflict. You would have thought, since A is on the table, B has no room on the table. That's what you would have thought. So first thing you have to explain is, what's the perceived conflict between A and B? And then we are told, even though A, still B, that means that although there is a perceived conflict, in this case, the conflict is overcome, and B manages to get into the picture even though A is there. You have a double responsibility to explain a statement like that. So what we're being told here is, even though we knew everything, understood everything, still it would be mitzvah to tell over the Exodus from Egypt. So the perceived conflict is obvious. If you're telling over a story, presumably that's to inform somebody of something he doesn't know. And here the presumption is we know the whole thing already. So why would you tell it over again? And then the Haggadah sort of pushes it to the end and says, and by the way, the more words you use, the better off it is. Here, not only in our sources, but a lot of other sources as well, you don't use extra words. Extra words tax the attention span of your listener and can lead to confusion. You should communicate information as concise a way as possible, consistent with being complete. Why would you say, no, the more you say, the better it is? So, and even so, we have a mitzvah to do that. So the answer that Rabbi Bullman gave, and it's an answer which carries through a dozen places in the Haggadah, is that the mitzvah is not to tell the story. That's not the mitzvah. And indeed, in the Hebrew, the phraseology is the saper be Yitzias Mitzrayim. Saper does mean to tell, but the base is very peculiar. It should be the saper es to tell the story. Saper be, to tell in the story, with the story, or something. And Rav Bulman's answer was that the mitzvah tonight is to relive the story, to re-experience the story, not just to tell it over. The point of the recital is to generate an experience. And if the point of the recital is generate experience, then you don't count words. In poetry, you don't think of, well, what information is being conveyed, and conveyed in the minimum number of words. Edgar Allan Poe wrote a poem called The Bells. And the refrain of each stanza is bells, 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 like 8 times or 10 times. If you have somebody reading it who's good, by the time you get halfway through, you can hear bells ringing. That's not information. That's creating an experience. That's what a lot of literature is designed to do, not just poetry.
But we're not allowed to have like a light show for the whole
I could talk about that, but what I'll say would be kind of bitter. Everybody today reads comic books. That's a tragedy. Because if you read a book straight, you'd have to exercise your imagination to create the picture in your mind. And as you read and get more information, you have to change the picture. That means you're engaged in the reading. You're engaged creatively in the reading instead of sitting back and just receiving. My first wife, who taught me about art and photography and the rest, she pointed out that black and white photography has an engaging factor that color photography doesn't have. Because when you look at a black and white picture, you have to put in the colors. So you're engaged in creating the image, not just passively receiving the image. Today, if you read the comic books, so you're just like a sponge. You're not engaged creatively at all. It's just part of the general laziness of the of the culture. So that's part of what the idea is. And the saper be means to relive the story of the Exodus. And it's similar to a verse which says that Moses, who grew up in the palace, at a certain point in time, went out to see his brethren, the Jewish people. And in that verse it says brethren twice. It means even though he grew up in the palace, that's what he thought of, how he thought of himself. And it says lir os be'echav. To see, not to see S, but to see, meaning to empathize with them, to share their experience. That's what the beis does as a particle, sometimes. And so that's the way he explained it here. And we'll take this theme and we'll carry it through, and it'll explain a dozen different things in the Haggadah. You got a question?
Okay, can you just repeat what's the name of the Rabbi who said this shot?
Nachman Bulman, Bulman. He was a Rav from America, and he came here, and he was a mashgiach here in Ohr Somayach for years. Indeed, I'll just push it a slight bit deeper. We were in Egypt for 90 years or so in physical slavery. We were there for 210 years, but not all of it was slavery. And we were also in cultural exile. We lost our grip, many Jews lost their grip on the heritage of the patriarchs. Many did practice idol worship. In the end, only 20% of the population left Egypt. The other 80% died in the days of darkness. So it was a struggle and a bitter period. Now, he said, not only was the people in a nation in exile and the culture in exile, but the language was in an exile. Because your language is how you express what you are, what your goals are, what your values are. Without language, it isn't expressed. One of the many failures of over-imagination of the academic world is to examine the remains of what they call early humans. That's another story, which we'll go into another time. And examine what they built and some of their practices, and interpret them and analyze them and explain them. So, for example, you have the cave pictures in France, other places, which are really, really beautiful. Why did they make those pictures? Why? Well, there are many theories. And because there are many theories, each theory is incompetent. One is that they were planning to go on a hunt, and this was a kind of good luck charm that they would have success on the hunt. And the other is, this is when they came back from the hunt and they were successful. And they were celebrating the success of the hunt. And another was when they don't have food and they're starving, they made pictures of animals to somehow make them feel good, even without, right? And then one party pooper said, maybe they just liked art, they did it for decoration. Yeah, meaning you haven't a clue. You haven't a clue. Without some linguistic remains to explain to us what they cared about, what they valued, and what their goals were, you'll never be able to know. They buried their dead. I actually saw someone say they must have believed in the soul, that's why they buried the dead. Really? Isn't that a bit of a jump? Maybe they noticed that the corpses, if left out, tend to smell bad after a while. They just wanted to get rid of them. Or maybe they thought it would produce fertility in the earth. Or who knows what? You don't know a human being's mind, his purposes, his values, his worldview without language. And we don't have the language. So Rabbi Bowman said that when the Jew and the Jew's culture was in exile, so was his language in exile. And when he regained his freedom, he not only regained his freedom, but he regained his identity, then his language was being redeemed. And he gave the following example. Let's imagine a person who, let's say he's 30 years old and he has an accident and he is blinded by the accident. But let's say when he's 37, some medical procedure is invented and they restore his sight. What would he do? Well, he would look around. What would he look at? Anything. A door, a wastebasket, a pencil. He would look to be able to see. He can see. It's the seeing that he prizes, not what he sees. It's the fact of sight. Here, Rabbi Bowman said, when we recovered our cultural identity and our language was redeemed from exile, we just wanted to talk. We wanted to speak as Jews. The speaking as Jews had its own meaning and value. And that's why the more you say, the better. That's one way to explain it. But the crucial idea here is that the purpose of the Haggadah is to relive the experience of the Exodus, and we're going to see that in spades. Okay, now we have various paragraphs, and you'll see that many of them express this theme. There was an incident that took place concerning 5 Tanoim, sages who preceded the creation of the Mishnah. Elazar, Yeshua, Elazar, Azariah, Akiva, and Tarfo were having their seder in Bnei Brak. You've heard of Bnei Brak, maybe you've even been there. And they were now Misaprim Be. They were saying and reliving the story of the Exodus from Egypt the whole night until their students came to them and said to them, "Our masters, the time for reciting the morning Shema has arrived." Which means that the mitzvah of saying, telling, reliving the story of the Exodus was over. It's only during the nighttime, it's not during the daytime. So the question is, why did they have to be told that? Did they lose track of the time? Why wouldn't they be able to know the time themselves? And even more, the commentaries point out that none of these 5 Tanoim had ancestors who were enslaved in Egypt. Not one. Some are Leviim, and the tribe of Levi was not enslaved, and some trace their ancestry to non-Jews, converts. So it means, in spite of the fact that they couldn't be thinking of their ancestors, my great, he was enslaved, and picturing that and having that make it meaningful to him, no. He identified with the Jewish people as a whole. This people, which is my people, were enslaved, and he was so involved in telling the story that time just didn't get registered until the Talmidim, the disciples who weren't that involved, did pay attention at the time, had to come and tell them that the time was over. If you understand that they are reliving the experience, you can explain why this happened. If not, could be other explanations, possible, but you'd have to search for one. Now, you have a quotation here from a Mishnah in Masechta Brachos. I'll read it to you and explain a little bit about it. But the question is, what's it doing here? Why do we have it in the Haggadah? Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said, I am as if I'm 70 years old, as if, whatever that means, and I haven't had the merit that the Exodus from Egypt should be recited at night. Meaning, that's my position. My position is every night. There's nothing to do with Pesach. Every night, the Exodus from Egypt should be mentioned, and that's my position, and I didn't have the merit to have a foundation for my position until Ben Zoma explained the following verse. And the verse says, in order that you should remember your Exodus from Egypt all the days of your life. And of course, the Talmudic position on language is everything has to be necessary for the meaning. What would have been lost if it had said, in order to remember your Exodus from Egypt, the days of your life? What does the all come to include? So the all should come to include something which, without the all, you might not have understood it would be there. So he says, Ben Zoma said, and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah took this on, it means, when it says the days of your life, you might have thought it meant daytime. Day could mean daytime. But it says all the days of your life, that's to include even the nighttime, which means that mentioning the Exodus in Egypt is twice a 24-hour period, once in the morning and once in the evening. And then I had a foundation for my opinion that it should be said twice a day on the basis of this analysis of the verse. Of course, the sages who disagreed with him weren't without foundation. They had a response. They said, you're right, the word kol has to come to include something that you otherwise wouldn't have understood. But that's not what it is. It comes to tell you the days of your life is this period of history. All the days of your life comes to include the time of the Mashiach. Always in the daytime, never in the nighttime. But to tell you that the later period of history, which you might have thought you wouldn't continue mentioning the Exodus of Egypt, you have to do it then as well. So now, to understand this thoroughly, we'd have to explain why nighttime you might have thought wouldn't have a mention, but it gets a mention anyhow. And the time of Mashiach wouldn't have a mention, but it gets a mention anyhow. Then you understand how each side uses the kol to bring in these two types. And to do it really well, you'd have to explain why this one said nighttime and not the time of the Mashiach. This is the time of Mashiach, not nighttime. We're not going to go that far. But the general idea here is this. How do we relate to the Exodus from Egypt? Well, our ancestors were slaves. And as we said in the first paragraph, had our ancestors not gone out, we would have been freed slaves. We would have just had that slave culture as part of our identity, and we would have suffered from that. But God took us out, and He gave us a new identity together with the freedom. Can you celebrate that under all conditions? Did they make a seder in the Nazi death camps? Yes, they did. Why did they do that? After all, they're not enjoying freedom. They're not able to express functionally their Jewish identity. Why are they still doing it then? And on the other hand, when it comes to the final redemption, in the times of the Mashiach, the verses tell us that what's going to happen when the Mashiach comes puts the exodus from Egypt into the shadow. It will pale in comparison to what's going to happen at the time of the Mashiach. So, do you continue mentioning the exodus from Egypt at a time when it's outstripped by later events which are closer to you? Maybe not. So in both cases, you would have had a thought, maybe we shouldn't mention the exodus from Egypt. One says at night, because night symbolizes exile. When we don't have complete freedom, or we're in extreme persecution, or at the time of the Mashiach. And that's why the word kol has to be used. One says for the nighttime, and one says for the time of Mashiach. That's the rough meaning of this Mishnah from Brachos. The question is, what's it doing in the Haggadah? This is about the mitzvah of mentioning the exodus from Egypt every day. Once a day, twice a day, this period of history, that period of history. We're sitting at the Passover seder once a year. Hello! Why are we doing this? So if you take Rav Bulman's idea on board, you have a pretty simple answer, and that is to say, don't get confused. The mitzvah of mentioning the Exodus, which we did in Shul when we said Shema, the third paragraph of Shema, which mentions the Exodus, that's not what we're doing here. Here we're going through a literary experience of reliving the events. It's a different mitzvah altogether. This is put here to juxtapose a contrast. In Shul, we mention the story. Here, we are reliving it. That makes that, and then you understand why it's here, to say that what we did in Shul is one thing, what we're doing here is something else. Yeah.
It doesn't really have to do with the Haggadah, it has to do with this Mishnah. It would seem like the Chachamim hold that there's a commandment to say Shema after when Mashiach comes.
Mm-hmm.
So they're holding that we would still have commandments and there's still like reward and...
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the idea there is, even though it's been outstripped by the later events, but the Exodus from Egypt is the foundation on which the later events are built. So, and it could very well be that the way in which we will record and recite and relate to the later events will be more invested with more time and more content, but this won't be forgotten. It will be also remembered and celebrated. So that's what but otherwise, if you don't say what I said, it's very difficult to understand why they would put the Mishnah here when it has nothing to do with what we're doing tonight. I need to say. Okay, the next introduction is to the 4 questions. The 4 questions is also a very, very deep and instructive passage. Maybe if you look at it before tomorrow, it'll be a little more familiar to you when we analyze it tomorrow, Mr. Shah.
Thank you.